Hello, I'm Shirley Adams with program number 5, Suave as Suede, but easier. And I say that because synthetic suedes are easier to work with and easier to care for than animal suedes. How many of you bought Ultra Suede or another brand of synthetic suede years ago and still have it sitting there, uncut, in its original state? Not because it's difficult to cut, it cuts like butter. It's the price that scares you. You've heard warnings about all the no-nos concerning it, and you're simply afraid of ruining it. Well, I want to dispel those fears, and I want to tell you what decisions you'll have to make for yourself and prompt you to get up the nerve to sew yourself a wonderful project. I think the place to start on this is to not worry about all the many brands on the market, but just separate them into two groups: the heavier suedes and the lighter weight suedes, and treat them accordingly. What I'm wearing is a lighter weight suede. So this one, notice I have soft styling. I have this gathered waist with a little belt that weaves in and out. Here's another one that is in the lighter weight suede. And with these you can put in, lots of gathers. I have gathers in the one I'm wearing. I don't in this one, but I do have some unpressed pleats down here. You can do soft styling in these lightweight suedes. Now, the difference is when you work with the heavier suedes is the fact that they are heavier. And because of that, you better keep straighter lines. They better not have many gathers in them. They better not have unpressed pleats, but sort of straight, tailored lines is what works best for any of these. I'll show you a couple of others here and show you some of the decisions I made because of the weight of the suede. This one on the bottom, for instance. One of the nice things with suede, and I'll show you in a minute how you can do this, the different seaming that you can do. With the heavier weight suedes, you have your choice. You can just make lapped seams, which I very often do, and in fact the 3 projects that I've already shown you, the green raincoat and these 2 suits, I have lapped seams. That means I have no conventional seams at all, which would be like this if it would be fabric. What I have instead is just lapped seams, one side over the other, and you can do that with the heavy suede. Now, a decision that I made on this one was due to the button, and the button alone is what made this decision. Just this button, big heavy thing with about 1/4 inch thick or so. Because of that, I decided those lapped seams with the raw edges are just too flimsy. So on this one, I made conventional seams, and then I was sure to do plenty of top stitching around, because without that it would puff out. It wouldn't lie as flat as it should. So anytime with conventional seams, do be sure to have plenty of top stitching. But it was that button alone that made the decision on this particular piece of suede. This one has a lot of pieces, this suit, and because of all the pieces, I decided to make lapped seams because I can save a lot of fabric that way. And I'm going to save all I can because of the cost of it. You might as well. So this one does have lapped seams because look, with the princess seams, there's one here on the side, at the side back, completely in the back. There are seams all over, and I'll show you in a minute how to eliminate some of those seams before you start and save the suede. This one I also have lapped seams because I wanted to just keep this one very light. It's a dressmaker style, soft styling really, not completely tailored. In fact, there's no interfacing in it at all. But it seemed to be appropriate to use the lapped seams. And here's another one with lapped seams, lots of stitching every place. One decision that you're also going to have to make on any of these is which way to use it. Ordinarily, you'd use it with the nap going up. You can't use both. You're going to have 2 different colors if you do. You can't use both going up and going down. But usually, for a deeper, richer color, it would go up. This one goes down because this is a raincoat. I actually wear it out in the rain. It's a great, practical coat, never spots. But because I was going to make a raincoat, I actually put a piece of this suede under the faucet before I started. And I saw that if it goes up, if the nap goes up, the deeper, richer color, what happened then is eventually the water kind of got caught in here, and it would eventually soak through and it wouldn't keep me as dry. I also discovered if I put it under the faucet this way, it was like water off a duck's back. It just sort of ran right down. So I thought, okay, raincoat, this is what I'm going to do with it. So you make a separate decision on every garment you make. They're all different, and you decide accordingly. First of all, about that lapped seaming and the conventional seams, I better show you that on a quick sample, just so you can understand a little bit more what I'm talking about. And before you start sewing, you better make some early decisions right here on the machine. What kind of needle you're going to use and what kind of a foot you're going to use. As far as the needle goes, I wouldn't use a standard needle necessarily because there's another one that's easier, and to mind might come a leather needle, which this one is. I wouldn't advise it. Here's the leather needle, and what a leather needle does is it cuts a hole. It actually cuts a hole every time you push it through the fabric. So if you would, and it isn't going through too easily. So I don't want to cut holes in this. That's like ripping checks out of a checkbook if you get enough holes there and it weakens the seam. So I don't want to do that. I'm therefore going to save these to use with animal leathers and suede. So no leather needle for this. You could use a standard needle, a universal needle. That works out just fine. Use it in a smaller size there, because there again, I don't want to make big holes. I'd rather have smaller holes. So I'd use something like a size 75, 11. That would do nicely. But this one is better yet. What this is a stretch needle. Now, I'm not doing a stretch fabric. We're talking swimsuits. This is not. But why I'm using a stretch needle for this is because it's Teflon coated and it goes in and out a lot easier and you'll have a smoother time of sewing. So there's the needle. I already have a stretch needle threaded in here. Then the foot. Some of you might find it's easiest to use a roller foot, as this one is, and that just rolls along the top of the suede. Some of you might find a walking presser foot easier, and that's the one that does move up and down every time you take a stitch. A Teflon foot might be a good idea on some of these brands because with that Teflon coating it scoots along them easier. Other brands don't even need it, so try it out on the scrap for the brand you're using and see what's best. And then my personal preference is this. It's a straight stitch foot, and notice the difference between a straight stitch and the conventional foot, the one that comes on that you can zigzag with. See that wide space right here where the needle goes in? See that little narrow hole there? I'm not going to do any zigzagging on this, and I must remember not to when I'm sewing. I must only straight stitch, but the reason I like to use a straight stitch foot is because it holds the fabric down more firmly. It kind of ensures that there won't be any play in that fabric because skipping of stitches is sometimes a danger with these synthetic suedes. And as long as you keep your fabric down flat, it isn't going to skip stitches. It's going to do a whole lot better. I'll just take this piece that I cut and do a little seam here and show you that this does nicely. Now what you also need to be careful of, and do this on a scrap when you first start to decide exactly what's going to happen on your machine depending on the settings you have, it's a good idea to possibly loosen the pressure a little bit on the presser foot so it won't push as hard, because if it pushes real hard it will do this. See how it just moves that top layer of suede along while I push? You don't want that to happen, so I've already dialed to slightly less pressure. And then when I stitch, I've also pushed the button here a couple of times to make a slightly larger stitch. Usually you have it set on about 2.5. This is up to 3.5. See how this back end is curling? What that's saying is that it is pushing the top layer along a little bit. So you're going to have to counteract that right away and decide what you can do to keep it taut. What I'll do is loosen the pressure a little bit more. But also something that keeps it taut very nicely is to hold the fabric taut. Hold it in back. Now I'm not saying pull it through the machine. You could throw the timing off and cause yourself a problem. But I'm just saying hold the fabric a little taut as you stitch. I'm not white knuckling it. I'm not getting really taut, but this way the top layer is not going to scoot along. It's going to hold in place a lot better. Now of course I was doing this without putting anything in to hold it, and you can put something in. For instance, pins, and for all the books you've read possibly that says, well, you can't put pins in, you'll have holes. Look at me, I'm pinning, I'm pushing these pins in and out. I can do it in this suede very nicely. In fact, if I want to, I can rip out this seam and start over again and you won't even see the stitching. So immediately I've dispelled, I hope, a couple of your fears. The fact that, oh, you're going to do something wrong and you can't redo it. Sure, you can redo it. When I take this out, you can't see where those stitches were, and so you can redo it. Now where you might have a problem, that ultra leather, this red jacket that I showed you a little bit ago, that one I can put pins in, it's not going to hurt it. I pinned this together when I was stitching it. I pinned the pattern on when I was cutting it out probably. But where you would have a problem is if you would run this through the machine and have a whole succession of holes there, then you might be able to see it because of the smooth surface. There's no texture on this, it's smooth. The reason you can't see anything in the ultra suede is the fact that it's hidden by the texture. So I can rip these stitches out and they won't show. The texture will take that away. That also gives you a hint to the fact that, if I grow 5 pounds, I really could redo a seam, let it out a little bit, and it wouldn't be tragic. And that's true. I've done that, and it does work out all right. So immediately, aren't you resting a little easier and thinking, I can do that. I'm going to be able to do some stitching. So, okay, get your machine all adjusted with the right equipment, and that's the place to start. Do also a few samples maybe of anything that you have questions about. Always try them on scraps to make sure that you know what you're doing before you start on your project. And then you're ready to go. So as far as the pattern is concerned, let's decide, we already did that we're going to use either a soft styling for the lightweight suedes and then a more tailored straight line styling for the heavier suedes. And then decide before you start doing all this how you're going to handle this, how you're going to treat it after you have the garment made. Are you going to dry clean it or are you going to wash it? Because you can do either. It does beautifully. If you dry clean it, it possibly stays just a little bit stiffer, and when this first comes off the bolt, here's one of the lightweight ones. This is Facile. This is considerably softer. Here's another lightweight one. This is the Ultra Leather. This is also soft. But if you get into the raincoat fabric that I had here a minute ago, the heavy one, this one will be a little bit stiffer perhaps if you dry clean it, or at least it will keep the same stiffness. If, on the other hand, you wash it, it will get slightly softer. Well, I'm not going to leave anything to chance, so before I started on the one suit that I showed you a minute ago, I washed a sample to see what would happen. And I just washed this with a regular wash load. I had 2 scraps here, the very same size that I had left over after I cut my suit. I washed one of them. I kept the other one as a control sample. You could see when they were together, they're the very same size. It didn't shrink at all. As I feel them, I really can't feel any difference. The new one is, which one? I'm trying to see. You can't see it. I have a W stitch there just so I could tell, because I really can't feel the difference. After it's washed one time, it feels about the same as when it's brand new. This also tells you that you don't necessarily need to pre-treat it. In fact, if you have 3-4 yards of it, it's kind of hard to put all that in the washer and pre-treat it. So don't be afraid of cutting it out. If you have any shrinkage at all, it would be just a small amount. And if it makes that much difference, maybe you're fitting this garment too tightly anyway, and maybe you ought to fit it a little bit looser. I didn't stop with that. I did another sample here. And what I have here is interfacing fused to the back side. And I washed one of these and kept the other one as a control sample. And I noticed that one is just a tiny, tiny bit smaller. Barely any at all. You can barely perhaps see where the top layer did shrink just a little bit. But there again, it shrank just a hair. And so it shouldn't make a whole lot of difference. Okay, the reason you want to pre-treat this is to make some decisions on what you're going to do as far as interfacing. If it's going to be a little bit heavy, I want to interface it with something like this weft, something that gives it a lot of body to beef it up. A tailored suit would do that. If I want it to be lighter weight and soft styling, then I'm going to use this other fusible, which is Easy Knit, to keep it softer so that it won't be quite as heavy. I'm also going to, according to how I'm going to wash it or dry clean it, decide what kind of shoulder pads to use in it. If you're going to wash it, be sure that you put some pads in that will go through the wash so that you don't have to worry about it. Then, as far as that lap seaming goes, what I did here really was a conventional seam. And this, of course, I could just pull open and you can see there's the seam. If you make this conventional seam, you're going to have to think about pressing it. It's a good idea to use something like this. I've made myself a sleeve roll, or this roll, out of a tube, out of a magazine, and covered it with a terry towel so it gives texture underneath. But look what happens here when I put the iron on it. I'll put it maybe down at the end where you can see it a little bit better. But what happens is I don't push these edges into the fabric, and that's good because you don't want to get any sort of an impression on the outside. But what's also good with this is to always put a press cloth over the top so that you won't have any worries about destroying the texture of it. So as I do this pressing, perhaps you can see under here, it's not mashing, I don't know if I can lift this up, it's not mashing those edges down into the fabric, and therefore you won't get anything showing. Now notice something else that happened. I didn't push that hard enough. I would need to work harder on it. It popped right back up. So this also tells you it doesn't press easily. So you're not going to make pleats out of it anyway. It won't be too tragic that it doesn't. But what that suggests is that top stitching every place is going to be a very good idea so that it will stay nice and flat so that it won't spring back. Okay, so this was a conventional seam. The other one, the lapped seam, is this. I'll just tear the same sample apart. And for a lapped seam, I'm going to put one side over the other and stitch through. Now what this tells you is that you can save a little fabric as you do this, and I usually just follow the edge of the presser foot for the first line. If I can get the threads back here, I follow the edge of that presser foot for the first line of stitching, and you can see how that's done, and nothing did any creeping. It did just fine because I did loosen the pressure slightly. And then the second side, I'm going to go right at the edge of it. Now if you use the foot and I want to get my hand back here so that I can kind of pull it to make sure that the top layer does not creep. So I am holding the suede a little taut, but again, I'm not white knuckling it, you can see, therefore I'm not pulling it all that hard, but it does keep it from scooting. Okay, this is a lapped seam. Now, the seam that laps is always front over back, side over, front side over back side, and so on. So you think, which is going to be the top side? That's the one that I don't want to have there. So instead of cutting seams, the regular type seams, if you decide on the lapped seaming for your project, that means before you ever start, here's a shoulder front, I can just fold that front out of the way and then put it down and cut it out. That way I save a little bit of suede. Okay, so decide about everything else you're going to do also besides just the seaming. You're going to do some darts, then actually do a dart. Put it in a scrap of this fabric and see what it's going to do. See what happens after you stitch the dart. You might think that, okay, after that's stitched, and I won't bother to tie it or anything, after that's stitched you might decide that it isn't going to press very easily, we already found out. You might decide that you want to do some edge stitching right there, and as long as you would do it in the same color thread, it wouldn't show up. I usually decide something beyond that. I usually slash these darts open in darts so that I can put it out flat before I do that edge stitching. But to stitch down, across, and up again holds that dart completely flat if you can't press it. Try pressing it first with the press cloth, and then you don't need it if you can do that. Buttonholes. One of the most wonderful things you can do with this is easy buttonholes. Now I do all sorts. On the garment I'm wearing, I made regular machine buttonholes. But before I did that, I tried it on a scrap. I also did those on the, or tried it on a scrap of the red jacket, the red leather jacket that I have. I tried machine buttonholes, and then I tried bound buttonholes and decided I liked that better. But bound or machine is what I'd use on any of these lighter weight suedes. On the heavier ones, I'm going to do something even more simple than that. What I'm going to do instead on the heavyweight suedes is simply stitch a rectangle around the edges and cut through it. And you can't get much simpler than that. Here it is. Here's where I've stitched a rectangle around it, and then you cut through it with either a craft knife or with one of these little buttonhole cutters that pushes in. That's about the easiest you can do, but don't do that on the lightweight suedes. It isn't sufficient. It's only for the heavier weight suedes. When you put this pattern down and cut it out, you can use either a rotary cutter or you can use shears, whichever you're more proficient with. Whatever you're best at is what you want to use. And if you're going to use the lapped seams, that means it needs to be a really good straight line. If you can't get that straight line with the shears, then that's where you want to use a rotary cutter. If you're going to have conventional seams, it isn't that important. So if you have little jags in your cutting, it's quite all right. As far as putting the pattern down and cutting it out, you can use weights, you can use pins, whatever, because the pinholes won't show. Marking, you can mark it with chalk, you can mark it with the markers of this sort that disappear after a few hours, so do it quickly if you do it with this type marking. Whatever way you like best, but try it on scraps to make sure it's going to work for you. The darts, I already showed you how to do a dart, but I'll just put it down here, move this out of the way. I'll just put some darts because before I made a dart on here, I tried everything imaginable. I tried making just a dart and pressing it, and I tried stitching it over to one side. I tried slashing it open. I tried cutting out the dart completely and just reinforcing it that way. So try every variable that you can think of that is going to make some sort of a difference. When you get to hems, there you see in the commercial ones, and it's a good idea to look at the ready-to-wear clothing first. for one thing, you'll be impressed with the price and the fact that you're doing it for so much less. But also, look at the type hems they did. Here's one where they did a very, and I saw this in a dress, they did a very deep hem and they have it all fused in place. That's really stiff. And if you wash it a couple of times, it starts to look kind of tacky. You can see where the fusing is. My personal preference, I tried all different sorts of them. My personal preference is just to fold under about 5/8 of an inch and top stitch it. I really don't use any fusing at all in it, but you can if you want to. As far as the pockets go, here again, I tried something different in this raincoat. I tried it on a scrap first. I wanted to make sure it was going to be just right before I actually put it in the raincoat because I was doing something a little bit unusual here. So try all those things and make no mistakes later on. And it's going to be a breeze. It's going to be very easy. And with any of these things, I have ripped out. I didn't do any garment perfectly all the way through. They have all been ripped out and redone at some point. So it's quite all right to do that. Another pocket here, just so I could remember how to do it step by step. I actually did a chart for myself so that I could do this. This is like a bound buttonhole. This pocket's the same thing. So it's just putting the strips here on it first, then putting the pocket down and stitching it. And then this is the moment of truth after you get that pocket down and after you get it stitched, because what you're going to have to do is cut. And once you cut through that, and the same with the bound buttonhole, once you cut, you can't go back and redo anything. So make sure everything looks right before you cut. And then it's just a matter of tucking this to the back side, and you're almost home free. It's going to be very easy then to just stitch those little this little triangle that pops up. It's going to be very easy to stitch it down on the back side, and here I have it stitched down on the back side. There it's stitched, and then stitch around the pocket and it's finished, but a buttonhole is virtually the same thing. So, I'm going to do a little bit of stitching here and see what else we want to do backing up about those seams. So if I just put two seams together, and I'll put these two together and stitch them and then cut them apart. I'm just going to do this standard 5/8 inch seam here, since I decided that on this suit, because of that big fat button, is why I decided to do this type of seam. Okay. And see how I am holding it a little taut so that the top layer can't scoot along. Okay, and then I'll just cut this open to simulate a seam. But with this one, I really don't want all that heaviness there if I'm actually going to top stitch it. So what I would do on this conventional seam is trim one of them down. And that one that I trim down is going to be the in-between layer. So that means after I get this trimmed down to, a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch perhaps, I'm going to of course press it, but to hurry things along I won't here. What I will do instead is just fold the long seam over it, turn it to the right side, and as I do my stitching on this, I've turned it around so it's now over under the arm of the machine. As I do my stitching on this, I will again just put that presser foot down with the edge of the foot right on the edge there of the seam, and since I didn't press it, I'm kind of opening this as I go along with my fingers. But I have found on one of the suits I have at home that I only stitched once in this way. I found that I wasn't too happy with the results after it was washed. It puckered a little bit right here. So since then, what I've done to every one of these seams is stitch it twice. Go ahead and edge stitch it the way you do also on the lap seams. You stitch that twice. It's a better idea, I think, to stitch this twice so that it will always stay out just very nice and straight and not do any of that nasty rippling. I not only like to look at the ready-to-wear for ideas to see how they did these various things, but then after you get your garment made, go look at it again. And what you'll be pleased about is the fact that I did that better than they did when they manufactured it commercially, because you take more care with it and you're more careful, you do a better job with it. So yours is going to turn out very well. Now notice I did this quickly. I didn't put pins in it, although I very often do when I stitch. I put pins in it because it pins so easily. So very often before I stitch, I have pins going there. But even without pins, it does very well. So I'm just trying to convince you, you are not going to have a hard time on this at all. It really is going to be very quick, very easy. You're going to be a complete success. and write to me and send me a picture of this marvelous suit that you've made after it's finished. Something else I wanted to talk about besides the buttonholes is the button here. Now, anytime I can, I like to stitch that button on by machine. If you've never done it, I'll quickly cut this off and stitch it back on, because I don't think I have another button handy. So come on, craft knife, do your job. Cut off the button without cutting my finger underneath, hopefully. I'm just going to stitch this one. It won't come off. That's wonderful thread. To stitch a button down, you take the foot off, of course, but notice the button I've used here. I've used one with holes in it because it does very nicely. Don't use shanks if you don't want to stitch it on by hand. So what I hope I've done is convince you that you're not going to do anything wrong. So what are you waiting for? This working with synthetic suedes and leathers is something you can successfully do if you just try. Experimenting on scraps if you need to find out any more answers, and get busy and good luck on it. Now, if you have any scraps left over, and you know you're going to, you always have scraps, don't throw any of them out. Think appliques, think belts, think bags, flowers or other accessories. Some of the examples of what you can do with those scraps are over here. And if you don't like to think belts, if you don't like to wear belts, turn the same idea that you have into a bag. It works just as nicely. So here I have this crumpled suede that made into a bag just as easily as it made into a belt. Here I have used little tiny scraps with this by cutting out those. I was stir frying the day I made this, you can tell. Did all this. Any little scrap will do. In fact, transfer some of your ideas. From this belt is where I got the idea for this jacket. So join us next week and I'll show you how to use some of those scraps.